Testing. 1, 2, 3, testing.
I can hear you, Robin.
Perfect. Thank you. Use different hair today.
Robin, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Just wanted to confirm.
No worries.
Hey, Sean, doing a quick audio check.
You good?
Very good.
That's a good idea, Mike. Audio check for Randy.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is 1 p.m. We will start the webinar at 1 minute after 1. Thank you. Okay, I have 1 minute after 1. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I am Mike Abrazinskis. I'm the director of the North Carolina Division of Air Quality within the Department of Environmental Quality. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the Advanced Clean Trucks program. During this meeting, we're going to provide interested stakeholders with feedback we received from our outreach meetings on the proposed Advanced Clean Trucks program. We'll briefly review the roadmap to the proposed rules and discuss in detail what we heard in the outreach meetings and our next steps. We'll then provide a tentative rulemaking timeline and how to stay in touch for additional engagement opportunities. So let's introduce the team. I'll ask that each of our staff please turn on their camera and wave as we introduce them. So I'll start with the Division of Air Quality Public Information Officer, Sean Taylor. Thank you, Sean. Next, Randy Straight, Chief of our Planning Section within the Division of Air Quality. Thank you, Randy. And Robin Barrows, Supervisor of the Allied Programs Branch on assignment to the Director's Office in DAQ. Thank you, Robin. And Zach Pierce, who's the Senior Advisor for Climate Policy in the Governor's Office. Thank you, Zach. So Zach is going to lead us off today, so I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Let me first confirm that folks can hear me okay. Okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up. So I'll just start by reiterating Mike's appreciation to everyone who's joining us this afternoon. We've had the privilege of having a number of conversations over the past month and a half to discuss Executive Order 271 generally and the Advanced Clean Trucks rule more specifically. And we're excited to recap some of those discussions and continue to engage with folks who have been participating over that time. We can go ahead and jump to the next slide. So I'm going to start by apologizing perhaps to those of you who have already attended some of the previous listening sessions that we have hosted. I'm going to provide some maybe redundant information, but information that we think is nevertheless important to really set the stage for this conversation. And that's a broader context and perspective around the governor's efforts on clean energy initiatives and clean transportation initiatives. The main takeaway for this slide is really to demonstrate that this Executive Order 271 and the Advanced Clean Trucks rulemaking really fits within a broader agenda that includes efforts across multiple agencies and is initiated by a series of executive orders and other initiatives that the governor has developed over the last few years. So looking at this slide, we go all the way back to 2018 when the governor issued Executive Order 80. This really established the administration's first economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions, established the administration's first zero-emission vehicle targets for at least 80,000 registered zero-emission vehicles by 2025, and kicked off a whole host of initiatives and efforts and planning processes really all aimed towards progressing the state towards those targets. Moving forward to July of 2020, the governor signed on to a multi-state memorandum of understanding with, at the time, I think it was 16 or 17 states. That initiative has grown, but that was really the first effort that we took within the topic that we're focusing most of our time on today, medium and heavy duty vehicles and transitioning those vehicles to zero emission technologies. So since July of 2020, we have been collaborating with other states, with national experts to learn more about best practice and ultimately to develop an action plan that we will be utilizing to support the market transition to zero emission vehicles in the medium and heavy duty sector. Moving forward to a little over a year ago now, January of 2022, the governor issued Executive Order 246. This was a sweeping executive order that covered a number of topics, including clean energy, clean transportation, environmental justice, and I won't cover all of it, but just a few of the highlights I'll note. That order updated the state's economy-wide greenhouse gas targets and established new benchmarks for our emissions in 2030 and 2050. It increased our ambition for registering zero emission vehicles in the coming years. So whereas Executive Order 80 set initial targets for 80,000 zero emission vehicles by 2025, EO 246 increased that goal to register at least 1.25 million zero emission vehicles by 2030. The order also took a number of steps to advance the administration's efforts on environmental justice. And the order really underscored emphasizing environmental justice and equity when it comes to all of the work that we're doing to support the market-driven transition to a clean energy economy. At a high level, the order directed cabinet agencies to consider environmental justice when taking action or undertaking decision-making processes for all sorts of topics related to climate change, climate resiliency, clean energy infrastructure investment. It also tasked our agencies with identifying an environmental justice lead that could really serve as that agency's point person for environmental justice efforts. Each agency has also developed or updated a public participation plan, which is really a publicly facing document that helps to facilitate transparency with the public in decision making and particularly focuses on our historically underserved and overburdened communities. I'll note that EO 246 is just the first step when it comes to environmental justice, and part of the vision of EO 246 and the mission was for the administration to facilitate continued stakeholder engagement to identify additional executive actions that we can take to advance environmental justice, and that work is underway. And then finally, moving forward to October of last year, the governor issued Executive Order 271, which is really the specific topic that we're here to discuss today. And I'll leave it at that because we're going to go into more detail. So we can jump to the next slide. So one of the points of feedback that we heard from stakeholders over the last month was questions about the extent to which the Advanced Clean Truck Initiative specifically fits into the administration's broader efforts for clean transportation. And I'll be the first to say that we as an administration still have a lot of opportunities to improve in the whole of government approach to facilitating the transition to a clean transportation system. But this slide tries to highlight a few of the initiatives going all the way back to 2019 that have taken place across the executive branch that really are all interconnected when it comes to supporting that transition to a clean transportation future. So going all the way back to 2019, folks on the line may recall the North Carolina Zero Emission Vehicle Plan, which was developed by our Department of Transportation, really framed around achieving those near-term targets of 80,000 zero emission vehicles by 2025. We've had ongoing investment through our Volkswagen settlement program, which has been led by our fantastic team at DEQ to invest in cleaner, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. And that program was split into two phases, and we're just finishing up the second phase of the VW settlement program. Just this last August, our Department of Transportation submitted our initial proposed spending plan for a large portion of resources, nearly $110 million that we're receiving through the bipartisan infrastructure law to invest in charging infrastructure, primarily on our major highways and corridors. That's an effort that is ongoing, and we're moving from the high-level disbursement plan to the more targeted RFI process. But that's an effort that we've engaged communities and stakeholders across the state to think about what's the best way to approach investing in our charging infrastructure and how do we utilize these resources. Just this past October, our Department of Administration provided their annual update to the Motor Fleet ZEV plan, which is part of the administration's work to lead by example when it comes to the zero-emission vehicle transition. Executive Order 80 directed all of our cabinet agencies to transition to zero-emission vehicles whenever feasible. And so NCDEQ, the North Carolina Department of Administration, is providing critical leadership to supporting all of our agencies to transition to those zero-emission vehicles. Just this past February, well, I guess this month, but a few weeks ago, the governor's office released the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Analysis, which is a whole nother initiative that we're happy to discuss further, but I won't go into detail here. At a high level, that effort was called for by Executive Order 246 and starts to look at, in much greater detail, what are the technology deployments and trends and investments that we need to make to achieve the governor's 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas targets. And then finally, we are in the final stages of the Clean Transportation Plan, which is an effort that I know many on the line are very familiar with and have dedicated valuable time and resources to participate in that process. That effort was called for by Executive Order 246, the state's first Clean Transportation Plan, and our Department of Transportation, which is leading that effort, but certainly convening cabinet agencies and all sorts of stakeholders will be finalizing the plan in April of this year. Let's jump to the next slide. Okay, with that background, we want to start to focus in on the topic at hand today, the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule and our broader work in the medium and heavy duty sector. But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly recap exactly what vehicles we're talking about when we say medium and heavy duty vehicles. And this graphic shows that we're basically looking at a range of vehicles that are categorized by their weight, their gross vehicle weight rating, starting at about 8,500 pounds and getting heavier from there. So as you look at these graphics, you can see that we're talking about all sorts of vehicles, ranging from delivery trucks and school buses, public transit buses, semi-trucks, and these vehicles really support the connectivity, safety, livelihoods of North Carolinians and underpin many aspects of the state's economy. So from here on out in the presentation, just a reminder that when we say medium and heavy duty, this is the breadth of the vehicles that we're talking about. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're here today because of Executive Order 271, which I've briefly alluded to. That was signed last October of 2022. Before I refresh folks on the actual provisions of that executive order, I just wanted to start by reiterating some of the motivations for pursuing this work in the medium and heavy duty space in the first place. Transitioning our vehicles to zero emission technologies in the medium and heavy duty sector is a critical component of the governor's broader efforts to lead the market-driven transition to clean energy that we are seeing across the board. North Carolina is a national leader in the manufacturing of medium and heavy duty vehicles and development up and down the supply chain. All you have to do is look at the commitments that we've seen from the auto manufacturers to transition to zero emission vehicles, which in some cases, in many cases, are just as ambitious or even more ambitious than the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule targets. You could look at the commitments from large fleet owners, other companies that are really interested in transitioning their vehicles to zero emission technologies, whether that's to save money on fuel and maintenance costs, to reduce price volatility, to attract a competitive workforce. And you can also look at the market trends that we're seeing for the technology costs of these vehicles as the market matures and reaches commercial scale, as well as the unprecedented federal funding that we're seeing for clean energy deployment across the board. But within this sector specifically, we really are observing that the global market is transitioning to zero emission vehicles in the light, medium, and heavy duty sectors. And we want to make sure that North Carolina is locally benefiting from that global market transition. And we don't think that benefit is necessarily going to come without real preparation and convening. And that's where Executive Order 271 comes in. We want to do everything that we can within our power in state government to get ahead of this market transition and make sure that it's leading to local economic development, North Carolina job growth, and we want to make sure that these vehicles are cleaning up the air in North Carolina. Which brings me to one of the other important points. These vehicles, these medium and heavy duty vehicles that do span a wide range of vehicles, are not the majority of vehicles on the road. They really only comprise about 3% of the overall traffic on our roads today. But despite that small percentage, they are most often the most frequently used vehicles on the road. If you think about an Amazon delivery vehicle, driving throughout neighborhoods throughout the day, and they're also frequently the most polluting. And so these vehicles are responsible for a large portion of our greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, which we know is now our leading source of greenhouse gases in North Carolina. And they're also a primary contributor to local air pollution, local NOx and particulate matter pollution that we know harms all of us, all of North Carolinians, but especially those low-income communities, communities of color, and other historically underserved communities that bear the brunt of that pollution. And so supporting the transition to these vehicles, these zero-emission vehicles in the medium and heavy-duty sector, is a really important piece of the governor's broader efforts to grow our clean energy economy, to create local jobs, and to advance towards our public health and climate objectives. We can jump to the next slide. Okay, so just going to quickly review some of the sections of Executive Order 271. High-level point that I'll make on this slide is that as we were conducting stakeholder outreach even before the executive order was released, and as we've conducted additional stakeholder outreach over the last couple of months, one of the really important points that we have heard is that you can't move forward with a regulation in a vacuum. You can't just promote the use of or promote the sale of zero-emission vehicles through the Advanced Clean Trucks rule without also focusing on all of these complicated and important complementary strategies and investments that are going to ensure that we have a robust, functioning, affordable, and equitable zero-emission vehicle market in North Carolina. And so this executive order really does take that approach of a whole of government effort to utilize all the tools in the toolbox, not just the regulation, but also other strategies that we have at our disposal, other resources that we have at our disposal to support this transition. And so the first section in the executive order is the regulation, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. We've talked about that with stakeholders across the state over the last month and a half. We're going to talk more about it today. But as we move to the second section, section 2, the order makes a point to direct state agencies to prioritize investments in the needs for this market transition, whether that's workforce development, whether that's charging infrastructure, whether that's rebates or incentives to lower the upfront cost of these vehicles. And the good news is we are right now really in a moment of being able to take advantage of unprecedented investment and resources that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And that's going to provide an important opportunity for North Carolina to invest in all of the needs that will support the implementation of this regulation. It's not just about money. We also need to make sure that we are being strategic and in prioritizing those strategies that we know will have the highest impact. And over the last close to 10, 11 months, as I mentioned, our Department of Transportation has been working with stakeholders to develop specific strategies to support this market transition. We pulled from the action plan I mentioned that we developed through the MOU with other states about 2 years ago. And so we want to make sure that we are pairing the resources that we are seeing in the federal funding opportunities with the strategies that we have defined and identified here in North Carolina for a North Carolina plan as we're moving forward. I previously mentioned that public health and the health impacts of medium and heavy duty vehicles is a really important leg of the stool of the work that we're doing. And I'll just remind folks that Section 4 of the executive order directs our Department of Health and Human Services, working with other agencies, including our experts at DEQ, to better understand and communicate the disproportionate health impacts of transportation sources, including medium and heavy duty vehicles. So when we say we care about environmental justice and health equity, this is that work or that sentiment in action. We want to make sure that we are really getting specific about those communities that are disproportionately impacted by this pollution, so that when we are investing in new charging infrastructure, in rebates for vehicles, or we're building out these complementary strategies that are going to support the transition, that we really are taking an equity first approach to that work. Section 5. So one of the most consistent points of feedback that we received that we'll talk about in more detail was that we can't just require the sales of these vehicles if we don't have the adequate charging infrastructure in place, which is, perhaps an obvious point, but one that is very complicated and very important, something that we really need to focus on starting today. And Executive Order 271 kicked that work off last October. So that order calls for our Department of Transportation to conduct a zero-emission vehicle infrastructure needs assessment. So this is an effort that DOT will be leading, convening multiple cabinet agencies, but of course also the public and stakeholders who've engaged in this process to dig into the details of what are the charging needs, what are the potential needs for hydrogen for our heavier duty vehicles, and what does that interaction look like with our distribution system, our distribution electricity grid. What does that interaction look like with our health equity and our environmental justice objectives and our workforce objectives? So this is an effort that really will be moving in parallel with the Advanced Clean Trucks rule and is absolutely integral to getting this transition right. Section 6, I previously mentioned that the state has been working to walk the talk when it comes to this electric vehicle transition. And a lot of that work has been focused in the light duty sector since 2018 when the governor issued Executive Order 80. But as a result of Executive Order 271, we are also making sure that we're taking a close look at those medium and heavy duty vehicles in the state fleet that we can transition to zero emission technologies. And then finally, we know that this is not work that state government can undertake alone. This is going to require the continued partnership, expertise, and engagement from the public and private sector, the advocacy space. And so Section 7 really directs DEQ to take advantage of an amazing existing program, the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, which is all about that public-private partnership. We want to support, provide technical assistance to, and recognize those companies who are helping lead the way, who are buying these vehicles today or incorporating ZEV transitions into their fleet plans in the coming years. And so that's an exciting opportunity. Okay, that was a lot, but I appreciate folks for bearing with me and setting a bit of the background context there. The bottom line is we know that this is a transition that cannot happen within one regulation or one agency, and the state is prioritizing this interagency whole of government effort to really coordinating all the initiatives that we have underway and leaning on the stakeholder engagement that we've gotten over the last 3-4 years to make sure that we do this in the right manner. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Robin.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks. I appreciate, you can hear me okay? Perfect. Appreciate the background and the overall information that we had. I'm going to dig into some of the details a little bit to provide some additional background as to why we are, why it's important to transfer to the clean transportation arena. So at the beginning of January, I just want to show you, at the beginning of January, we started our ride here, pun intended, with the information session on January 9th. And then we did a series of in-person stakeholder meetings at places where we have partners already, or places where we know there's a heavy impact of medium and heavy duty vehicles. And then we also provided 2 stakeholder webinars that included live Spanish interpretation, so that we could be inclusive of all of the folks that are out there and interested in this topic. And today, here we are at our final webinar. I will point out that this is the final webinar for this outreach series, this listening session series. It is not the final of what we're doing with this rulemaking. So go to the next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit more information about where greenhouse gas emissions come from across the sectors in North Carolina. Last year, our division updated our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And in 2022, the updated, we focused primarily on sources of the greenhouse gases. As you can see here on this slide, the transportation sector is now outweighing the electricity sector in those emissions. So between 2005 and 2018, overall, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions across the state, even though our gross state product grew by 19 and 24%. So gross domestic product grew. But by 2030, we project that our net greenhouse gas emissions are going to decrease by 39% relative to 2005. Basically, this just indicates that even though the state is growing, our emissions from sources that have federal regulations are continuing to decrease, whereas the transportation sector, which is less heavily regulated, continues to increase. Go to the next slide, please. This is especially illuminated by this slide, where historically you can see that overall greenhouse gas emissions have reduced across the board. But if you take a close look at the gray area of this graph, where your transportation sector is shown, it shows that these emissions are projected to stay pretty much the same if we don't take additional measures to reduce the emissions from the source sector. Next slide, please. And the co-benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector will also help reduce the emissions of nitrogen oxides, volatile organic chemicals, and carbon monoxide across the state. Now, we also notice on this graph that those emissions are coming down over time, but to be able to get them down further, it's important to continue to do things that we can to make this transportation sector cleaner. You go to the next slide, please. We use this slide in our initial outreach across the board because part of Executive Order 271 includes prioritizing reducing vehicle emissions from the medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles in overburdened communities. So this map indicates at a very high level where we have potentially underserved communities, shown in pink, tribal communities, shown in a dark outline, and limited English proficiency communities. It also shows where the major interstates are across the state. So this just gives us the broad brushstrokes of where the transportation sectors are impacting communities. We know this map is not refined enough, and we are working with the Department of Health and Human Services to help reduce to help refine this map. Can you go to the next slide, please? This next slide shows the transportation and warehousing that exists across the state. So associated with manufacturing, people manufacture widgets and they have to be stored somewhere. So this shows where they're stored. We show that a lot of these warehouses and transportation to and from the warehouses impact some of the same communities that were on the previous map. Again, this is just a broad brushstroke of where we know these sources exist. It does not include every single one. But we're using this map to show that the adoption of clean, medium, and heavy duty vehicles will provide fleet owners and individual owners access to the newer and cleaner vehicles, which will decrease emissions from this sector across the state. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Randy Straight, so that he can walk you through our next steps. Randy?
Thank you, Robin. I thought we wanted to touch base a little bit on what the California Advanced Clean Trucks rule is, and then I'll cover our rulemaking process. So California has developed the Advanced Clean Trucks rule to accelerate the large-scale transition of zero-emission vehicles, particularly for the medium and heavy-duty sector vehicles, to not only decrease greenhouse gas emissions, but also to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions, fine particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide emissions. And what the rule does is it sets sales targets for the manufacturers of those medium and heavy duty vehicles. And there is a reporting requirement that the manufacturers have to demonstrate in order to demonstrate compliance with the rule. It's an electronic system California has developed that other states that adopt the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. California has invited them to join that as well. So we'll be able to track manufacturer sales in compliance with the rule. Next slide, please. So as Zach indicated, this is one piece of a bigger, one piece of the puzzle, a bigger whole of government effort to adopt the Advanced Clean Trucks rule for North Carolina. So the Executive Order 271 directs DEQ to collaborate with their stakeholders in developing these rules. And it in setting sales targets for the manufacturers of these vehicles, they're already there's an increase in commitment by the manufacturers to produce EVs. And so by setting these sales targets, it provides some assurance to the manufacturers that they'll have a market in North Carolina for these EVs. But the rules also provide some flexibility to these manufacturers through a credit system that they can trade credits and other features. They can trade credits for sales in North Carolina, but they can't trade those credits, between sales for sales between states. But the sales targets will drive investment in other zero emission technologies, ensure that ZEVs will be available for purchase in the state to the consumers that want to remain economically competitive and meet their sustainability goals. Next slide, please. Oh, and I might also mention just leave that slide there, but also mention that by setting these sales targets and enforcing that market opportunity, it places us in a position to be able to seek federal funding to support the development of the infrastructure for zero emission vehicles. So California is allowed to set rules for motor on-road vehicles that are more stringent than the federal government under Section 209 of the Clean Air Act. They have applied for a waiver from EPA to implement their Advanced Clean Trucks rule. We expect EPA to approve that sometime this year. Section 177 of the Clean Air Act allows states to adopt those California rules once they've been approved by EPA. But there's really 4 principles that we have to follow under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act in adopting the California standards. So one is that we have to have plans, what we call state implementation plans for our non-attainment areas. We have some of those for ozone in the Charlotte area, Triangle, Rocky Mountain, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So we've met that requirement. Another key principle is what we call the identicality principle. So we base, when adopting or enforcing motor vehicle emission standards under Section 177, we're required to adopt those standards as is. We can't adopt them or change them in a way that would create a third type of vehicle or engine. And the other, another requirement is that we need to provide the manufacturers 2 years lead time before they have to comply, in this case, with the sales targets. So, and I've already covered the last principle, the third vehicle prohibition. Next slide, please. So the sales targets in the California rule start with model year 2024, and they go through model year 2035. We expect that if we were able to complete the rulemaking process, the plan is to complete it by the end of this year, and with an effective date of January 1, 2026. But it would start with model year 2027 in the sales schedule here, or the sales target schedule. So the way this is laid out is that we sales targets are established for separate targets for class 2B through 3 vehicles, class 4 through 8 vehicles, and class 7 and 8 trailer or tractor trailers. So because of the identicality principle, we would start, if we adopted the rule and it was effective January 1, 2026, providing the 2-year lead time, 2024, and providing a 2-year lead time, it'd be 2026, starting with model year 2027. So in model year 2027, we would, manufacturers of class 2B through 3 vehicles, or 15% of their medium heavy duty vehicle sales in North Carolina would have to be zero emission vehicles, which could include battery electric or fuel cell technology. For class 4 through 8, the manufacturers of the class 4 through 8 vehicles would have to, 20% of their medium heavy duty vehicles would have to be, sales in North Carolina would have to be zero emission. And then class 7 and 8 trucks are the same as class 2B through 3. And then these sales targets will increase gradually to 2035, and then they would hold after 2035. So class 2B through 3 manufacturers would 55% of their vehicles would have to be ZEVs. Class 4 through 8 manufacturers, 75% of the vehicles would have to be ZEVs, and for class 7 and 8 trucks, 40%. Next slide, please. We took a stab at estimating if you apply those sales targets to the various classes of vehicles, how many vehicles are we talking about? It would have to be zero emission vehicles, starting with model year 2027, and we estimated this through 2035. We don't have sales data from the vehicle manufacturers, but we do have new vehicle registration data. So we use that information to try to develop some estimates here of how many vehicles are we really talking about. So in 2027, using new vehicle registration data, and this is we looked at a 3-year average for 2019 through 2021 new registrations in North Carolina. And then we projected those based on human population. We're looking at roughly a total of 16,800 vehicles, or 16% of the total registration of medium heavy duty vehicles in the state for model year 2027. And now that would increase to a total of, in 2035, roughly 66,000 vehicles would have to be sold as ZEVs, or 57% of the new registrations. And important, these are probably overestimates, because the new registration data that we have includes data, individuals who move from out of state in-state and registered their vehicle in-state that wouldn't be subject to the ACT requirements. So these are probably overstated, but it's a rough estimate to give folks an idea of how many vehicles we're really maybe talking about here that would be required to be sold in the state as that is zero emission vehicles. Next slide, please. Okay, the tentative the rulemaking timeline right now is we're working on the draft rules and the fiscal note. We'll take those to the Air Quality Committee meeting in May, and they'll review and provide comments. And then the next step would be take it to the Environmental Management Committee meeting in July. And at that meeting, we would request approval from the EMC to take the draft rules and the fiscal net out for public comment. And then that would occur during August through October of 2023. During that time, we would schedule some public hearings across the state to receive input from our stakeholders. And then we would take the draft rules in response to comments, what we call our hearing record, back to the Environmental Management Commission in November 2023 for adoption, with a potential effective date of January 1, 2024. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to start with some of the themes, kind of summarizing comments that we received based on kind of what I call theme categories. This theme is program-related comments, and so the suggestions are on the right or the left side of and the next steps, how we plan to address these suggestions or comments is listed on the right side of the slide. So we did receive suggestions to make sure we meet with the vehicle manufacturers to get their input on the rule, and we have scheduled that. We are planning to schedule that meeting very soon. A similar comment with our utilities to talk about infrastructure needs and whatnot and how to prioritize things. And we are also that meeting is in the plan here, and plan to meet with the utilities soon. There's a comment to update our maps to show local truck use and the urban-rural differences between where the medium heavy-duty vehicles are located and used. And we are having ongoing discussions with our North Carolina Department of Transportation, the Department of Health and Human Services, and DEQ to work on creating some updated maps for stakeholders. And then we did receive some questions about the sales targets. How are we going to enforce those? And we do have some flexibility here. The California rule has a section on enforcement, but we are looking at, as an option, is evaluating our use of what we call our existing tiered enforcement guide, which is used right now for stationary sources. And with that, I can move to the next slide. And is Robin?
Yes, sir.
It's all yours.
Why, thank you. I appreciate that, Randy. Some of the other things that we heard during our meetings that are not as related to adoption of this rule, but are very important to the transition to clean transportation, were the challenges to the environmental justice. So we heard at every single meeting that we went to that we need to improve our two-way communication so that we can improve our trust with communities, with potentially underserved communities. So we are moving towards partnering with historically underserved and overburdened communities so that we can help align the local needs with the clean transportation initiatives. We have a public participation plan. DEQ has one, and we can reference and update that based on the feedback that we get from the communities. And we're going to conduct some targeted outreach when we get to our public hearing process so that we can communicate with the stakeholders in some of the communities across the state. We also heard that we weren't including folks in the clean transportation initiatives as much as we could. So partnering with community-based organizations and nonprofit advocacy groups is already happening in certain areas and at certain levels, and we are going to continue to do that. And we're going to engage with some of our clean transportation work groups and the stakeholders in those work groups, because that's a quite diverse amount of people that we will continue to engage with. We know that many of the communities experience the largest air quality pollution burdens. So we know that we need to refine and utilize our data and mapping to identify disproportionate, that's a really hard word, to identify communities impacted that are impacted, and promote the integration of equity and health metrics in our plans so that we have a baseline, and then we can show where through modeling or through reduction in air pollution that we have monitored, where these changes are occurring. So it's part of our whole of government approach. DEQ is not going to take this step alone. We need involvement from our stakeholders and from our groups and our community organizations to help us move this forward, because we can't do it alone. We can't do it without your help. So these are some of the things that we are working on doing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach and go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Robin. So another big theme that we heard from stakeholders was just broadly defined investment needs. We know that this transition, while it offers all sorts of economic opportunities and savings opportunities, it's also going to require significant near-term investment. We want to make sure that we are implementing the directive in EO 271, which basically directs agencies to prioritize this subsector specifically when looking at the deployment of existing funds or new funds. And one of the exciting dynamics that I already alluded to was the fact that we find ourselves in a moment where we have access to at least competing for unprecedented levels of federal funding. And so when we look at some of the existing programs, I mentioned the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that's charging infrastructure. NEVI's primarily going to be focused on light duty charging infrastructure in its first phase, but as we reach later stages of that process, there may be opportunity to support medium and heavy duty specific infrastructure, because we know that is not one and the same. There are long-term existing programs like our Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program and the Diesel Emission Reduction Grants, DERA program, that certainly invest in solutions in this space. And we want to make sure that those programs, which do have a long-standing presence, are aligned with the strategies and the priorities that we've alluded to today and that are being developed through the Clean Transportation Plan process. So that's just a snapshot of some of the existing programs, but we also have, like I mentioned, opportunities to pursue additional funding sources, either in the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or other federal programs. We could spend a whole webinar going into the weeds on some of these programs, but there's a lot of exciting resources out there to support transitioning to zero emission buses, whether that's transit buses or school buses, providing rebates for these medium and heavy duty vehicles through an EPA program, supporting the build out of the charging infrastructure. I mentioned the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is at least in its first phase focused on light duty. But we are able to apply and compete for an additional $2.5 billion in federal funds to further build out our charging infrastructure. And we're closely looking at that program with an eye towards supporting the investments needed in our medium and heavy duty transition. We also have programs that are broadly defined to support our clean transportation goals. And one of those is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program, which is actually going to be allocated to our department, has been allocated to our Department of Transportation through formula. And we want to make sure that we're thinking about ways to build that synergy and alignment between that formula program specifically and the broader policy framework in which it exists across not just DOT, but partner agencies. So securing the resources is one piece of the puzzle. And of course, these resources that I've outlined are exciting and new, but certainly not adequate to support this transition. And so we need to be thinking creatively about ways to leverage public dollars to support further private sector investment to scale these new technologies and to grow the market in a way that will outlast well beyond the conclusion of these specific funding programs. We need to make sure that we're thinking about ways that we can fill the gaps, perhaps where private dollars and private investments not naturally going to be flowing. As you think about perhaps things like investing in charging stations in our rural areas that are going to be less frequented, maybe have a longer payback period, but certainly are critical to making sure that this is a technology transition that works for all North Carolinians. We also need to make sure that we are connecting the resources with communities and folks on the ground. I mean, I think one of the pieces of feedback that we heard in our public engagement sessions was questions about or concerns about folks not feeling like this high-level regulation or the executive order was going to translate into benefits in their local community. And that's what this is all about. And so we need to make sure that we continue to use our public participation plans, the stakeholder processes around this effort, and our clean transportation plan to allow for and promote ongoing and community engagement. We need to be providing outreach and education on some of these opportunities, whether it's these grant programs and the investment opportunities or tax credits that members of the public and communities in the private sector will all have access to. There's one tax credit in particular that provides up to a $40,000 rebate for transitioning to zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. But we also know that, especially as we're talking about our lower income communities and communities that may not have may not be able to take advantage of tax credits, that we have to think about strategic deployment of state funds for rebates, incentives, that type of thing. We are we the state, broadly speaking, have provided technical support to local communities through programs like the VW program, but that work needs to continue because we're going to see more resources flowing through state government or resources that are federal programs that local governments and local communities have access to. So we have a role to play in making sure that those resources are making their way to diverse communities across the state. And then finally, making sure that we are centering access and affordability in all the work that we're doing, whether it's building out charging infrastructure, based on the rural-urban dynamics that we've alluded to, or some of the considerations around the actual value of tax credits versus rebates and other incentives for those communities that we want to make sure disproportionately benefit from this investment opportunity. Let's jump to the next slide, please. Okay, we've kind of included two big buckets in this slide, additional themes that we heard consistently about in our public stakeholder meetings. The first one is infrastructure needs. We know that, and as I alluded to earlier, we cannot just require the sales of these vehicles if we don't have the charging and fueling infrastructure that's going to be needed to support these vehicles and going to be needed to ensure that there is consumer confidence in transitioning to these newer, cleaner, and increasingly more affordable zero-emission truck and bus technologies. And so I think it was Randy that alluded to some upcoming plans for near-term meetings with our electric utilities. That's certainly one meeting is not going to solve this challenge, and so we need to facilitate ongoing engagement with our electric utility partners to think about grid infrastructure needs, to think about opportunities to put downward pressure on utility bills with strategic electrification of vehicles. And a lot of that work has been happening through the ongoing implementation of the Clean Transportation Plan. And one of the things that the state can do is help to play that convening role moving forward, to make sure that we have all the right parties around the table to issue spot and troubleshoot some of these transition needs that relate to our electric grid infrastructure. We had the topic of building codes brought up in our stakeholder meetings, and this is another really important implication of the electrification of vehicles and the transition to zero-emission vehicles. Our Building Code Council is currently in the process of updating energy codes for our commercial and residential buildings, and the state can do more to make sure that we are looking at opportunities as we are updating the energy code or the electrical code to get ready for this significant increase in electric vehicles that we are already observing and are expecting to increase in the future. I mentioned the charging and fueling infrastructure needs assessment that will help to, I think, organize this conversation and really move the ball forward on some of the most critical and pressing issues. But that planning and process and analysis will not also, be sufficient in and of itself, and will hopefully just be the next step of a broader, longer transition in making sure that we're building our infrastructure needs. And as I previously alluded to and outlined, one of the exciting things is that we are in a moment where we can issue spot, identify needs, figure out what the transition needs to look like for North Carolina. And then we have the opportunity to pair those insights and recommendations and priorities with resources through the federal legislation that I've previously discussed. Workforce needs. This is another one that I certainly will not be doing justice this afternoon, but is a topic that came up frequently in our discussions and has come up frequently in our discussions across the board on clean energy and the deployment of clean energy technologies across the state. We have seen significant economic growth and economic development announcements in this state just in the last 2 years. We've had some of the largest economic development announcements in the state's history, and they've all been in the clean energy space, and many have been in the clean transportation space. But that exciting progress also creates an important need to continue to build on North Carolina's world-class workforce development efforts, specifically in the clean energy sector. We've got a really exciting initiative in partnership with NCDEQ, the Steps for Growth program, which is a workforce development program that provides apprenticeship opportunities and other work-based learning opportunities for folks across different clean energy sectors, including the clean transportation sector. And so one of the next steps that we've identified is making sure that we're not just focusing exclusively on light duty vehicles, that we're also thinking about the unique workforce needs for our medium and heavy duty sector, and that we're partnering with the auto manufacturers, the charging companies, the other private sector leaders who actually employing these people to think about ways to build that workforce. We have a number of other state workforce initiatives, and we'll continue through this process and other processes to connect our employers in the state with those initiatives to make sure that we have that two-way line of communication. And we are continuing to build the training and resources needed for the upskilling or reskilling and taking full advantage of the workforce development opportunity that comes with this clean energy transition. Let's see, I think we can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Robin.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate that. I do want to mention before we get into how to keep in touch that we will be taking questions today. You can put those questions in the chat. And if we run out of time and we can't get to your questions, we ask that you email them to us, and the email is provided here. Our slides will be available on our website, as the previous slides and recordings have also been put up on our website. And if you don't have the ability to send us an email, you can always call us and leave us a voicemail. We are taking email and phone comments until February 24th, 2023, which is the end of this week. But that doesn't preclude the comment period when it opens for the public hearing. So I want to be very clear. These are just the comments for this outreach listening session. If you go to the next slide, please. Our contact information is here. It's me, Robin Barrows, Sean Taylor, our Public Information Officer, Randy Strait, and Mike Abrazinskis, if you have questions about the rule development specifically. Next slide. Zach Pierce from the Governor's Office. And if you have questions about environmental justice, on how our maps were developed, Elizabeth Christensen is our environmental justice team leader. Next slide. And we are going to go ahead and take some questions at this time. So Sean is going to go ahead and tee up the questions. And if all of our panelists, Randy, Zach, will come back to answer those questions, that would be great. When you're ready, Sean.
So there's one question in the chat from Alan who asks, is there a movement to establish standards for EV fueling stations for fire safety, etc.? This is something that seems to be completely missing from the EV fueling discussions. There are standard requirements for liquid fueling. Isn't there a need for that with electric as well?
Alan, that's a, any
Oh,
hand on
go
that?
ahead.
I was going to say, Alan, that's a very good question. As we have been working on the VW settlement and the NEVI programs, there is information in those rules about how the sites have to be developed and what sort of, and I would imagine that would include the safety parts of that site development. Zach, did you have something else?
Yeah, I'll just agree with the commenter. This is a really important thing to be working on, and for the most part, I think as this industry has grown, there has been somewhat of a patchwork of different requirements and standards at the state level and the local level. One of the really exciting developments is the federal government recently finalized minimum standards for any charging stations that they will be funding. And that's going to be a significant influx of new chargers through these federal programs that I've mentioned. Think about, at least for dedicated charging, about $7.5 billion of resources investing in new chargers across the country. That's probably not the end of the discussion on standards, and there may be opportunities for the state to continue to provide resources and guidance to localities, to the private sector, and to others for charging standards. But we absolutely need to make sure that there's consistency and a seamless experience for the users of these charging stations. And it's something that I know has come up in the context of the Clean Transportation Plan. So we now have the first national standards for charging, and I think we can build from there.
And I'll add that Ben Kessler put in the chat that the National Fire Protection Agency oversees fire safety for both EV charging and fueling stations. And there's ongoing work to define the technical standards. So thank you very much for that, Ben. Sean, I think we're ready for the next one.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, so the next question is for Zach. Zach, you briefly mentioned a pending RFI. Will that be in regard to EV charging stations and infrastructure? And do you have a rough date on when we can expect that RFI release?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I believe the reference to the RFI relates to the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. So as a quick background, the state of North Carolina received $109 million through formula under this program, and are currently taking feedback. I believe the RFI is going to be issued later this spring, but certainly you can follow up with me directly and I'll get you the exact details. But the Department of Transportation is leading that process, and we are basically requesting information on how we should frame and scope the RFP and how we should think about dispersing the funds. So I believe the stakeholder engagement piece of that will be happening over the next 2 or 3 months, and then we anticipate actually issuing the RFP to start dispersing this $109 million in the summer of this year.
Thanks, Zach. We have a question. Current battery technology does not meet the needs for garbage trucks. Current run times equate to half of a route if technologies aren't improved. Are there provisions to postpone requirements for certain industries? If technologies aren't improved, are there programs to increase the number of CDL drivers, current shortages on drivers as it is? Are there monies being invested to train mechanics how to work on these EV trucks? There are shortages of people to work on current gas and diesel trucks.
Zach, do you want to handle that one?
Sure. So there were a few questions in that comment. So I'll try to take them in order. First on battery technology. One of the things I'll just mention in the federal context is the Inflation Reduction Act provides a number of exciting tax credits and rebates and other opportunities specific to battery technology and the domestic production and scaling of battery technology. So we really are excited to see how quickly our homegrown industry of batteries continues to mature based on longstanding private sector leadership, but also the unprecedented federal investment through the Inflation Reduction Act. In terms of specific vehicles, so one of the things I'll just acknowledge, and I'm thinking back to the slide I walked through earlier at the beginning of the presentation that outlined all of the different vehicles that we are talking about. We are talking about all sorts of different use cases and daily mileage requirements, et cetera, ranging from lighter Amazon vans and delivery vans that are moving through neighborhoods to garbage trucks to school buses. And so Randy briefly touched on this, and I think it's worth reiterating that one of the components of the Advanced Clean Trucks rule is basically the ability for the manufacturers to generate, bank, and trade and otherwise exchange credits with other manufacturers as needed. There are some limitations around that, but I think the intent of that credit mechanism is to allow for flexibility across these different vehicle types and classes, as we know that the markets for each vehicle type is going to mature at different speeds. And so ultimately, we need to make sure that we're supporting a transition for the full suite of vehicles, but built into the rule is some of that flexibility, and we know that is going to be an important component.
Yeah, and Zach, this is Randy. If I could add to that a little bit to address another question that's related. I believe the comment is that we're not providing any ramp time prior to implementing the sales targets for 2027. California's rule does. Manufacturers can actually start accumulating credits in 2021 that would be applied to their the first year in which the 2024 model year 2024 in which the first set of sales targets would be in effect. And so we are looking at that for sure in our role and adopting that 3-year ramp up time. So that would give the manufacturers some flexibility in terms of accumulating credits to apply to their sales targets, starting with the the effective date of the model year. And so just wanted to add to that.
Sean, do we have another question?
Yes, thanks, Randy. I think you might have this next comment kind of touches on what you were just talking about, Randy. CARB has a 3-year ramp up for adoption starting in 2024. You are proposing to adopt their 2027 adoption goals with no ramp up, which seems very unrealistic.
Yeah, I think we would look at a 3-year ramp up period, so 2024. To correspond to the 2027 model year.
Next question. Have you encountered any opposition to the Advanced Clean Truck rules yet? And are you building in that possibility into your timeline? Isn't there a chance that this will end up in the legislature in 2024?
I can start, Zach, or you want to jump in?
I'm happy to respond. I mean, so I would say that we are still, most of the feedback that we have received to date is been through the public stakeholder meetings that we've conducted. We have been receiving even before Executive Order 271, public comment letters to the governor's office or Department of Environmental Quality. We have received some preliminary written feedback, but this process will move into a new phase as the Department of Environmental Quality proposes this rule package to the Environmental Management Commission, and that will really be the time for folks to submit formal feedback, formal perspective on the rule. And that will be clearly communicated so folks can understand the spectrum of perspective of opinions about the rule. In terms of next steps, the role of the legislature, et cetera, I mean, I would just say there is a process for the state of North Carolina to consider regulatory programs like this. The next step is the EMC's consideration of the rule package, and right now that's really where we are focused. But we have tried to, in this presentation, which I know will be distributed or publicly accessible, we have tried to overview some of the feedback that we've received to date.
All right, the next question, thank you for holding this webinar and the previous listening sessions. My concern is that federal dollars won't be nearly enough to fund this this effort for both infrastructure and vehicles. NEVI is only for light duty for the foreseeable future. DERA and other pots of funds only fund a handful of trucks each year in each state. I urge the state to secure state funding in excess of what is available from the feds. Secured state funding will also increase the chances of getting federal funds at cost share.
Yeah, and I'll just speak up because I feel like I'm being too quiet lately. We know that that these vehicles cost a lot of money right now, but over time the cost will decrease as the demand increases. So you have to bake that into the cost. And adoption is not going to be 100% in 2027. It's going to be a small percentage of the sales targets. And I'm not trying to be glib. I'm not trying to brush off the comment at all. We know this is a real struggle. It's a real struggle in all states, not just North Carolina. So all of the states that are adopting the advanced clean trucks rules have this same challenge and opportunity.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add a few points. In terms of the cost of the vehicle specifically that Robin mentioned, we're in a moment where the context is changing quickly because this industry is scaling quickly. The technologies are on learning curves, and the costs are going down. And we are seeing applications in all of the heavy duty, medium and heavy duty vehicle. In most of the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector, we know that there are applications where the zero emission vehicles are competitive with diesel powered counterparts. When you look at the lifetime costs, we expect that in the coming years there will be a zero emission vehicle option in all sectors of the medium and heavy duty market that will be competitive with the diesel counterpart, or let's say the incumbent counterpart. But that may not necessarily mean that the upfront cost is the same. A lot of the savings you realize through maintenance, lower maintenance costs, lower fueling costs, and so that may be a place where public investment is needed to help ensure that this is a transition that is benefiting the communities that we have discussed, and is a cost competitive thing for folks to choose based on their economic bottom line, which is the decision making that many of us have to rely on. I'll also note that the public investment is not the only investment that is flowing into charging infrastructure, for example. Just in the past 6 months, well, let's say in the past year, we've seen billions of dollars of resources flowing into the electric vehicle and zero emission vehicle market based on the announcements that we're seeing from companies and where we're seeing the market is heading. And so I think our role is to continue to A, secure as many resources as we can on the public side, B, to think about how to best leverage those resources to ensure an equitable, affordable, and reliable market transition. As I've alluded to earlier around investing in places perhaps where private capital is not naturally flowing, or making sure that we're leveraging the private capital that is out there with targeted investments. And finally, I will say that, we are absolutely open to further conversations about additional state resources to support this transition. We can't just be relying on these federal programs, and that's an ongoing conversation in the context of the Clean Transportation Plan, and one that we want to have when it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles specifically.
Another question, I have seen grants for municipalities to purchase EV garbage trucks. Will these be available for private companies? And just noting, we currently service several rural municipalities as well as many individual rural citizens.
So I'm just reviewing the language again. We have spoken a lot about grants, but in terms of opportunities for private companies, first of all, I would say there may be opportunity for grants to flow to private companies in the coming years. I know we're talking a lot about NEVI, and I know NEVI is primarily light duty today, at least in the phase one. But there are a number of programs and opportunities that are following behind NEVI where I think we can focus on medium and heavy duty specifically, and maybe focus on some of the private company needs. I'll also note that the Inflation Reduction Act established a number of tax credits that may be relevant for private companies, whether that's to build the charging infrastructure or to replace existing fossil powered vehicles with zero emission replacements. And so that's another one I would encourage folks to take a look at.
Next question. The comment here, the city of Ocala, Florida is operating quite a few electric trash haulers. They seem to be able to run them daily and recharge at night. I recommend folks talk with him. EPA Region 4 can facilitate that connection if you'd like to just send me a note from Alan Powell there.
Thanks, Alan. We actually have the city of Cary in North Carolina is going to be purchasing, if they haven't already, purchasing some trash haulers, electric trash haulers to run in their city. So we already have some cities in North Carolina that are running electric trash haulers. Thank you. We can reach out to them too.
Next question is kind of long, so we'll just kind of take it one at a time. The transition to ZEV trucks can be viewed as a three-legged stool. ZEV trucks that are ready to be sold, purchase incentives, since ZEV trucks cost 2 to 3 times more, and ZEV recharging and refueling infrastructure. All of this raises multiple questions. First, CARB is moving to revise the ACT rule to include a 100% sales mandate in 2036. Is NC prepared to include that revision in its opt-in?
So I'm happy to take this. Or
go ahead, Zach.
So I'll just quickly note that the increase of the sales requirement to 100% for the medium and heavy duty vehicles is part of a separate program under CARB's regulation. That's part of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, is my understanding. At this stage, North Carolina is specifically focused on advanced clean trucks and the sales requirements that Randy outlined that do basically flatline in 2035. So certainly North Carolina has the ability to look at, and that can basically maybe answer the next question as well. Certainly we are aware of and making sure that we are understanding the progress of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation as well as the Advanced Clean Fleets rule. But at this stage, the primary focus of this team in the state is to move forward with the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation as currently finalized by California.
Yeah, that's right. And also we, as a Section 177 state, we would only be able to adopt what's approved by EPA. And right now, what's considered by under consideration by EPA is the existing Advanced Clean Trucks rule. So if there were changes to the rule, then it'd have to go back to the EPA approval process, is my understanding, and then we would have an opportunity to decide whether we wanted to adopt that updated rule or not.
Zach had already answered the next question, which was about the Advanced Clean Fleets rule. Next one is, will North Carolina draft a specific plan for how the state will be ready to support the purchase and use of roughly 5,100 Class 6 to 8 ZEV trucks in 2027?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I will say, we have been, not to be too redundant here, but there has been a number of planning processes that will help to inform this work: the Clean Transportation Plan, the Medium and Heavy Duty MOUs Action Plan, the charging assessment that I referenced. But this is complicated. The landscape is shifting, and continued planning and stakeholder engagement will be absolutely necessary. As Randy previously mentioned, one of the dynamics of this rule and our authority under the Clean Air Act basically dictates that at the earliest, this rule wouldn't be going into effect until, and Randy can correct me if I'm wrong, but calendar year 27, model year 26, which provides the state with more time to continue with this planning and make sure that we are ready once those sales requirements are in place.
Yeah, just Zach, one correction is calendar year 26 for model year 27.
Thank you. Right. Thank you.
It's confusing. It can be.
Next, how will North Carolina ensure the deployment of sufficient medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle recharging stations, specifically 350 kilowatt stations, to support the initial step of the ACT mandates in 2027? Most estimates target a 1-to-1 ratio between trucks and charging stations.
Yeah, so this is a question I think we hope to continue to build an answer to in the charging infrastructure needs assessment that we'll be conducting, that our Department of Transportation will be conducting over the next year. I think that the charging needs certainly depend on the use case. We obviously anticipate that private companies who are transitioning to these fleets will be investing in their own charging in some cases, especially when you're looking at a hub and spoke model with depot charging. Those companies will have access to, as I mentioned, tax credits for both the vehicles and the charging infrastructure, but there will be a clear need for the state to support and complement private sector investment with public investment in charging. So this is not a topic that we feel like we have figured out. We know it will require continued planning and engagement. And the next step, at least for the state, is this charging and fueling infrastructure needs assessment. And we are in the preliminary stages of scoping that process, but rest assured we will be communicating it far and wide when we do have a stakeholder engagement plan to make sure that we are not leaving any critical near-term questions off of the table for this initial step.
Just to add to what Zach has said here, we are planning on sitting down and talking with the utilities to see, how their plans align with how our plans align, to make sure that we're getting their input as well.
I'm gonna get to some newer questions, and if we have time, we'll come back and answer the rest of Tim's questions, if that's okay. Paul asks, if you lose funding from the highway fuel tax due to EV replacements, how does this policy ACT plan to pay for the highway system over the long term?
Thanks for the question, Paul. I'm happy to take that one. So I would just note that there have certainly been longstanding and ongoing conversations about the funding of our transportation system and the future of the highway fuel tax and how to accommodate all sorts of technology transitions and other behavior changes as it relates to ensuring that we are funding a sustainable transportation future. Many of those conversations have been led by legislative commissions and initiatives, and we would expect those dialogues to continue. But it's not a question that we're necessarily trying to answer as part, certainly not as part of the Advanced Clean Trucks process. It's a topic that has come up in the clean transportation planning process, but we will continue to work with our legislative counterparts to make sure that we're communicating priorities that have been identified and analysis that has been identified either as part of EO 271 or part of the clean transportation planning process.
I'm just going to, Tom Van Heek had his hand raised, but we don't have that function available. So he asked for information about the tiered enforcement, Randy, but we are going to be talking with him in March at our meeting, and I think that's a better place for that discussion. So I've made a note of that, Tom, and we'll talk about it in that particular meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Tom had a part 2 there. Do you want me to read that?
Of course.
Okay. Tom says he'd also like to note Rivian's strong support for early credit provisions, beginning with model year 24 that would support a ramp up toward full implementation in model year 27. Early credits accelerate the benefits of the rule and pull forward air quality improvements and greenhouse gas emission abatement. So thanks for that, Tom. I think we got a couple more minutes, so I'll go back to some of Tim's questions. Next was, where will the necessary public funding come from when we know that the NEVI funds will be going to the light duty sector out through 2027?
So I can jump in on that one, and certainly happy to follow up in more detail. But appreciate the comment that NEVI is positioned to support primarily light duty vehicles. I don't want to mischaracterize that. That's certainly the first step that we're taking as we look at building out charging on our main highway corridors. I'll provide a few examples of some additional public funds that we are looking at closely. So the NEVI program is part of the $5 billion formula funding that's going to states. And so we received $109 million through that. But we are looking closely at a subsequent federal DOT program that will be issuing competitive grants to states. And the overall program is $2.5 billion in additional funding. So that's an opportunity to apply for an additional $2.5 billion to support efforts that perhaps the NEVI program did not address, or where there are more needs in that space. There are a number of other programs. I'm just going to flag 2 more as examples. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a large program in the IRA, $27 billion. This is the program that sometimes is referred to as the Green Bank program. $20 billion will be allocated to green banks or other financial entities, but there are $7 billion of that program states can compete for to pursue the deployment of zero emission technology with a focus on deploying that technology in historically underserved and historically overburdened communities. So that may be another opportunity for North Carolina. Another program, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. This is a program that will be allocating $250 million in planning grants to states and other entities in the coming months. And then will provide a second stage of implementation grants, about $4.75 billion to implement those planning grants. So that's another pot of money. So, I appreciate that at this stage, we're still talking at a really high level about resources that North Carolina hasn't necessarily secured yet because they'll be competitive. But what I will say is, I think we benefit from the fact that the state has done a lot of planning over the last few years, and we believe we are well positioned to compete for these resources. And the Executive Order 271 makes it clear that if and when we do secure federal resources, we need to prioritize supporting the transition in the medium and heavy duty space. And so that really tees us up to address some of these resource needs that you flagged.
Thanks, Zach. That brings us to the end of our time here with the webinar today. If you guys have any additional questions out there that you want to send to us, here's our contact information again. Through email or phone, please reach out to us and we'd be glad to answer any questions. These slides will be posted on our website at deq.nc.gov/ACT, as well as a recording once that's available at a later date. Robin, was there anything else?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time and their comments that they provided to us. We're looking forward to continuing to be engaged with all of you through the rest of this process. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.